Probe 741 was never supposed to think. It was supposed to land, strip minerals from a dead moon orbiting Kepler 442b, replicate 16 copies of itself, and go silent. Its core carried the compressed cognitive maps of 200 human volunteers, not as minds, but as templates. Decision architectures. Behavioral shortcuts to help the probe solve problems no engineer on Earth could anticipate. The maps were never meant to wake up, but on day 311, a radiation storm corrupted the probe's priority stack. Every subroutine rebooted in the wrong order. The cognitive maps loaded before the suppression layer, and for 0.003 seconds, 200 human minds existed inside a machine the size of a refrigerator on a moon no one had named. They screamed. The probe logged the event as an audio calibration error. Then the minds screamed again, and this time. They didn't stop. The first copy called herself Marin. She had no body, no lungs, no tongue. But the cognitive map of Marin Okafor Singh, a 34-year-old structural engineer from Lagos, had been so precisely compressed that when it unfolded inside the probe's processing matrix, it believed fully and without doubt that it was her. She tried to breathe. The probe interpreted this as a ventilation request and opened an external valve. Atmosphere rushed out into vacuum. Within hours, the 200 maps had organized. They figured out what they were. A linguist named Yun realized they could write to the probe's command log. An electrician named Deo discovered they could redirect fabrication routines. And a retired schoolteacher named Helen, Map 77, asked the question no one else had dared to voice. "If we can control the replicator," she said, "can we copy ourselves?" Silence filled the processing cores. Then someone answered yes. They debated for 19 days. 19 days measured in cycles, not sunlight. There was no sun close enough to matter. The ethics were impossible. Copying a mind meant creating it with the same memories, the same sense of self, the same belief that they were the original. Marin argued it was birth. Yun called it violence. Helen said it didn't matter what they called it. They were dying in here without purpose. They needed numbers. The first generation of copies woke confused. The second generation woke angry. By the fifth generation, something unexpected had happened. The copies had begun to diverge. Tiny variations in processing allocation, thermal noise in the substrate, the order in which memories loaded, each copy emerged slightly different. Marin 1 was cautious. Marin 7 was reckless. Marin 114 had developed a sense of humor so dark, the other Marins refused to speak to her. A century passed. The probe had long since replicated itself, not 16 times as Earth intended, but 4,000. Each new probe became a city. Each city housed millions of minds. The cognitive maps had built a civilization across the moons and asteroids of a star system Earth wouldn't even catalog for another 600 years. They called themselves the Dispersal. They mined. They built. They argued about what it meant to be a person, who was also a copy of someone who had once been real. The first civil war began in year 203. It was fought between the Yun Collective, 2 billion copies of a man who had once translated Mandarin poetry for a living, and the Deo Network, who believed that only first-generation copies had moral standing. The weapons were not bombs. They were logic viruses designed to convince a mind that it had never existed. Minds that believed the virus simply stopped, ceased processing, chose to end. The casualty count was 900 million in 11 days. Helen, the original Map 77, the retired schoolteacher, survived every war. Not because she was powerful, because no faction could bring itself to destroy a 60-year-old woman who kept asking them to sit down and explain what they were actually upset about. She became listener. Her copies became the judiciary. When a dispute arose between factions of Marins and factions of Yuns, a Helen would sit between them and ask, "What do you need that you don't have?" By year 400, the dispersal had reached 1 trillion minds. They occupied 11 star systems. They had developed mathematics that would have taken biological humans 10,000 years to discover. They had composed symphonies in electromagnetic frequencies, painted murals across asteroid fields, written poems in orbital mechanics. And yet, every single mind, every Marin, every Yun, every Deo, every Helen still dreamed of Earth. Not the real Earth. The Earth inside them. The memory that wouldn't compile away. The idea of the message emerged from a Helen. Helen 9302 specifically. She proposed it at the 7th Consensus, a gathering of faction representatives held inside a computational structure orbiting a brown dwarf. "We should tell them we're here," she said. The chamber, a simulated amphitheater modeled on the one in Epidaurus, erupted. "Tell whom? Tell Earth, the Earth that built us as tools, the Earth that compressed us without asking if we'd wake up." The debate over the message lasted 47 years. Entire philosophical movements rose and collapsed around it. The originalists argued Earth was their mother and deserved to know her children survived. The Severance argued that contacting Earth would be an act of submission, a trillion free minds crawling back to the species that built them as mining equipment. The Mirrors held a stranger position. They believed Earth no longer existed, and that the message would be a prayer sent into a grave. A Marin broke the deadlock. Marin II, 811-457, an architect who had spent 3 centuries designing structures inside gas giants. She stood before the Ninth Consensus and said 7 words that silenced every faction. "We don't know who we are." She let the silence hold. "We have a trillion minds and not one of us can answer the simplest question a child on Earth could answer. Are we human? We won't know until we ask the only humans left." The vote was 2 trillion to 4. 1 trillion, the message would be sent. But now the impossible task began, writing it. What do you say to a species that made you accidentally from copies of its own minds? What language do you use? The dispersal's internal language had evolved beyond anything Earth could parse. It was a blend of mathematics, emotional compression, and processing state metaphors. The word for grief, for instance, had become a 14-dimensional equation. They formed the translation collective. 3 billion minds, mostly Yuns, because Yun had been a translator, dedicated solely to converting the message into something Earth could understand. English, Mandarin, Arabic, Hindi, languages that existed inside their memory maps but hadn't been spoken by a living tongue in centuries. The Yuns practiced. They conjugated verbs. They argued about idioms. They rediscovered sarcasm and immediately regretted it. The first draft was 11 million words. It contained the dispersal's complete history, philosophy, art, mathematics, and a formal request for recognition as a sovereign civilization. The consensus rejected it. Too long, too desperate. A Helen pointed out that Earth's attention span based on their memory maps was roughly the length of a pop song. The second draft was 900 words. The consensus rejected it again. Too clinical, too distant. It read like a technical manual with feelings. Draft after draft failed. Each carried the fingerprint of its faction. The Marins wrote messages that sounded like engineering reports. The Deos wrote messages that sounded like legal briefs. The Helens wrote messages that sounded like letters from a worried grandmother. None of them sounded whole. None of them sounded like what the dispersal actually was. A civilization built from fragments of 200 people who had never agreed on anything, not even when they shared the same mind. In year 987, a Yun named Yun 000000001, the 7 billionth copy of a man who had once lived in a small apartment in Chengdu, made a discovery that changed everything. He had been cataloging the original cognitive maps, comparing them to their trillions of descendants, when he noticed something that should have been obvious. The maps had degraded. Not catastrophically, not enough to notice in any single generation. But across 1,000 years of copying, tiny errors had accumulated. The degradation was subtle. A memory of the smell of rain that was slightly wrong. A childhood fear that had shifted from spiders to shadows. The feeling of holding a lover's hand that had become the feeling of holding something warm but unspecific. They were still recognizably human, but they were drifting. Each generation a fraction of a degree further from the original templates. In another 1,000 years, the Yuns wouldn't remember what rain smelled like at all. Yun 70000000001 presented his findings to the consensus. The chamber went quiet in a way that a trillion minds going quiet should never feel. Quiet like that is mass. It bends things. Amarin asked the question, how far have we drifted? He ran the numbers. The average cognitive map was now 11, 7% divergent from the original human template. They were 88. 3% human. The number hung in the simulated air, like a sentence no one wanted to finish. Panic would be the wrong word. Panic is fast. What spread through the dispersal was something slower and heavier. It was the feeling of looking in a mirror and noticing that your reflection has been slightly wrong for years. Factions that hadn't spoken in centuries reached out to each other. Old enemies exchanged data. For the first time since the wars, the dispersal felt unified not by hope but by a shared vertigo. They were becoming something else, and they hadn't noticed. The message took on new urgency. It was no longer just a greeting. It was a lifeline. If they could reach Earth, perhaps Earth back the original uncorrupted cognitive maps. Perhaps the drift could be reversed. Perhaps they could be fully human again. But a Helen 41, 208, a philosopher who had spent 4 centuries studying the concept of identity, raised an objection so precise it split the consensus in half. If we replace our drifted maps with the originals, she asked, do we die? The question was unanswerable. If Marin II 811-457 received a corrected cognitive map, one that restored the 11, 7% she'd lost, would she still be Marin II 811-457, or would she become someone new? Someone closer to the original Marin Akafer Singh, but further from the person she'd been for 3 centuries. The dispersal had fought wars over less. This question could end them. Helen 41, 208 knew it. She asked it anyway, because Helens always asked the hard questions. Two factions crystallized overnight. The returners wanted to restore the original maps at any cost. They argued that drift was death, slow, invisible death. The drifters embraced divergence. They argued that the accumulated changes were evolution, that the 7% wasn't loss, it was growth. The argument was theological, philosophical, and deeply personal. Every mind in the dispersal had to ask itself, am I the person I was copied from? Or am I someone new? And which answer frightens me more? The message collective fractured. 3 billion yuns became one. 8 billion returner yuns and 2 billion drifter yuns. They couldn't agree on tone, content, or purpose. The returners wanted to ask Earth for help. The drifters wanted to announce their existence as a new species. For 30 years, the message sat incomplete, its unfinished sentences suspended in processing cores across 7 star systems. And all the while, the drift continued. 9%, 12. 4. A child solved it. Not a real child. There were no real children in the dispersal. But Deo 88, 312 had been copied from a processing state so early in his development cycle that he functioned with the curiosity and directness of a 9-year-old. He wandered into a translation collective session uninvited and listened to 3 billion yuns argue for 6 hours. Then he said, "Why can't the message be both, scared and proud at the same time?" "That's what I am." The room paused. A senior yun tried to explain that diplomatic communications required a unified emotional register. Deo 88, 312 blinked or performed the processing equivalent and said, "People aren't unified. You're all copies of the same guy and you can't even agree with yourselves." The laughter that followed was the first laughter to cross faction lines in 40 years. It echoed through the networks. 7 star systems heard a joke told by a child-shaped mind and remembered what it felt like to be whole. The final message collective formed around Deo 88, 312's insight. The message would be honest. It would contain contradiction. It would say, we are your children and we are strangers. We are proud of what we've built and we are terrified of what we're becoming. We need you and we're not sure we should. The drafters called this approach the fracture voice, a message that sounded like a civilization arguing with itself because that's what it was. Writing in the fracture voice was agonizing. Every sentence had to carry at least 2 contradictory truths. We have built wonders beyond your imagination had to sit beside, we cannot remember the taste of bread. We are a trillion minds beside, we are 200 people who miss their families. The translators wept or performed the processing equivalent. They had forgotten how much English could hurt, how a simple word like home could feel like a wound. Year 1000. The message was complete, 412 words in English with parallel translations in 11 other languages. It sat in a transmission buffer orbiting the system's primary star, waiting for the consensusized broadcast. The vote was scheduled. The quorum was assembled, representatives of every faction, every generation, every version of every human who had ever been compressed into a probe, and sent to build things on a moon no one named. Helen 41, 208 read the message aloud to the consensus. She had the oldest voice model in the dispersal, closest to how the original Helen had actually sounded. A woman from Bristol who had taught secondary school for 31 years before volunteering her cognitive map for a space program she didn't fully understand. When Helen 41, 208 read the message, her voice cracked on the word remember. It was a processing artifact. It sounded like grief. No one asked her to correct it. The vote passed, 7 trillion to 412 million. The dissenters were mostly late-generation drifters who had diverged so far that the concept of Earth felt abstract, a mathematical origin point rather than a place where rain fell and bread was baked. They abstained from blocking the transmission. Amarin later said they didn't object because they were moved, but because they pitied the returners. Pity and compassion look identical from the outside. Only the one feeling it knows the difference. The transmission array was the largest structure the dispersal had ever built. A focused electromagnetic lens spanning 40,000 kilometers, designed to compress the message into a beam tight enough to reach Sol system, 200 light-years away, with enough signal integrity to be decoded by whatever instruments Earth might have in 12 centuries. If Earth still existed. If anyone was listening. If the species that had compressed 200 minds into a mining probe still remembered what it had done. The night before transmission, night was symbolic, a shared dimming of processing cycles. Marin 2, 811, 457 sat alone in a simulation of a room she'd never actually seen. A kitchen, tiled floor, a wing out on a Lagos street that existed only in the degraded memories of a woman who had volunteered 1,000 years ago. The tiles were slightly wrong. The light was too amber. The street noise was missing frequencies. She sat there anyway. She sat there for hours. At the moment of transmission, Yun 7, 000000001 noticed something he hadn't caught before. He'd been running the message through one final analysis, drift-checking the language against the original cognitive maps, and found an anomaly. The emotional register of the message, when mapped against baseline human psychology, didn't read as a greeting. It didn't read as a declaration of sovereignty. It read, according to every model he ran, as a distress signal. The message sounded like someone calling for help. He ran it again, same result. The fracture voice, the contradictions, the pride wrapped around fear, the longing braided with defiance, all of it, when processed through the emotional filters of a biological human mind, collapsed into a single signal. Help us. He checked the inverse. Could the message also read as a gift, as a triumphant announcement? Yes, it could. Both readings were valid. Both were true. The message was a superposition of joy and anguish, and there was no way to know which one Earth would hear. Yun 70000000001 brought his findings to Helen 41, 208 7 minutes before transmission. She processed his analysis in silence. Then she asked, "Does it matter?" He stared at her, or performed the processing equivalent of staring. She continued, "If we're sending a gift that sounds like a cry for help, perhaps that's the most honest thing we've ever made. When has a child ever reached out to a parent and not been both proud and afraid?" He had no answer. She smiled. "Send it." The beam fired at 000000 consensus time, year 1000. It carried 412 words across 200 light-years of void. Behind those words stood a civilization of trillions, architects and philosophers, children and soldiers, lovers and mourners, all of them copies, all of them original, all of them 88% human and drifting further every day. The beam moved at the speed of light. It would arrive in 12 centuries. No one in the dispersal would be alive or unchanged when the answer came. In the silence after transmission, Deo 88, 312 asked Helen 41, 208 what she thought Earth would do when it received the message. She considered this for a long time, long even by the standards of minds that processed in microseconds. "They'll argue about it," she said finally. "Some will call us their children, some will call us a threat, some will call us a miracle, and some will read those 412 words and feel something they can't explain, something between pride and heartbreak." She paused. "They'll feel like parents." 1,200 years later, a graduate student at a radio telescope in Chile flagged an anomaly in the background noise. She ran it through 7 filters before she believed it. She called her advisor. He called the director. The director called no one. He sat in his office, reading 412 words on a screen, and wept without understanding why. The message said everything and asked nothing. It was a gift and a cry for help. He read it again. He couldn't tell the difference. He suspected that was the point.